A Gamer's Wish, a Gamelit series, Hidden Wishes Book 1, written by Dao Wong, narrated by Patrick Zeller. Chapter 7. After my disastrous first quest, Elle took an active interest in my activities. The next evening, she showed up at my door with an agenda and a refusal to take no for an answer. Lily was not invited on this trip, a fact that the jinn did not seem to mind, other than a request for more shawarma. Over the next hour, I was introduced to the hidden world denizens of my neighborhood. It seemed that I had, unknowingly, moved into one of the hubs of the supernatural community. While it was not necessarily better, most supernaturals liked to live and work together for convenience. The services and skills they might require, from full-body hair grooming for minotaurs to the specialized diet of dryads, made sense to keep localized. Before each encounter, Elle would squeeze my triceps and growl a warning to behave myself, and in just about half the cases, I'd remember not to put my foot in my mouth. The other half generally had me alternating between squeals of geeky fanboyishness and minor eeps of terror, even wide-eyed fear in a few cases. "Do you think you can hold it together for this next meeting?" Elle hissed at me as we walked up a staircase. "It'd help if you told me what I was meeting beforehand," I said. "Huh, you almost ran away when I told you we were about to meet later." "She was a Medusa," I said, my voice rising in protest. "And the best hairdresser in the city. You nearly cost me my next appointment." Elle snapped and shook her head. "What? You think if she turned people to stone all the time, no one would notice? Lada's kept her secret for years, but she won't if a certain someone keeps shouting about it." Sorry, I lowered my voice. "You've got to give me a break here. Meeting creatures from myth is kind of out of my comfort zone." "Well, get better. This is your life now," Elle said, as we finally reached the floor. I had to pause for a second to catch my breath before Elle led us to the correct doorway. Thinking better of it, Elle added, "Shane's a dwarf." "Oh." I relaxed at that. I could deal with dwarves. I mean, vertically challenged individuals weren't exactly unusual. When the door swung open, I had a smile on my face, all ready to be polite. "Gimli!" Oops. But seriously, beyond the fact that Shane was lacking both his armor, axe, and helmet, he could have passed for the famous dwarf, at least as portrayed in the movies. Dark red hair and braided beard of the same color with deep-set eyes and a thoroughly unamused look on his face. "Shane, this is Henry. He's a newcomer to our world. I've been showing him around a bit," Elle said after she finished extracting her elbow from my ribs. "Hi, sorry about that," I said. "It's just, you look like—" The glare that was shot at me shut me up. Shane nodded gravely to Elle before glowering at me as he spoke. "I don't have time for this. Charlie's gone missing again. I was just about to go looking for him." "You need to keep your windows closed," Elle said. At my confused look, she added, "Charlie's Shane's cat." "Oh." I paused, and then realized a way I could make it up to them. "Hey, I can help. If you've got some fur, I could probably locate him for you." Elle hastily added, "He's a new wizard." Wizard. I nodded and surreptitiously rubbed my ribs. Damn, the pixie had sharp elbows. "A new wizard," Shane said guardedly, before he shut the door in our faces. The pair of us traded looks while, within, we could hear loud movement. Just as I was about to knock again, the door flew open, and Shane held his hand out. The hairball he dropped into my hand made me wrinkle my nose in disgust. "This work?" "Should." I called upon the knowledge of the link spell. A few hand gestures later, the hairball glowed, a line of red appearing before my eyes. "Link cast, synchronicity 63%. "Well?" Shane said, and I blinked. "This way." I turned to take the staircase down. The line led diagonally downward, showing the shortest route from me to the cat, I presumed, which of course didn't take into account minor things like floors, walls, and gravity. As I walked, tendrils of red would flash for a second from the hairball before dying. Each new tendril, each second that I held the original connection, drained my mana as I focused on keeping the spell tuned to Charlie. We walked down the stairs and around the corner, through an alleyway and out a side street to another alleyway. I barely paid attention to my surroundings other than ensuring there were no metallic death machines barreling down the road when I crossed. By the time we made it across the street, a slow-growing headache had begun to form as my mana depleted at an astonishing rate. Just as I was about to release the spell, I heard a cry of happiness behind me.
"Charlie! There you are, you horrid beast!"
Shane shoved me aside as he ran forward. Charlie, rather than a feisty tomcat with a patch for an eye, was instead an elegant Persian who proceeded to snuggle into Shane's beard, almost disappearing in the dwarf's arms.
"Thank you. Charlie always does this. But ever since those damn wares moved in down the street, I don't dare let 'em run around outside. Never know when they get hungry."
"Do werewolves eat cats?" I asked, and Shane looked me straight in the eye and nodded.
"Aye, and don't let them tell you otherwise. While Mrs. Brindle, down my hall, lost her Angie just a week after those wares moved in."
Elle made a face as Shane continued to speak, one that was lost to him as he snuggled his cat. "Well, we should get a move on. I need to show Henry around a bit more."
Of course. I should get Charlie back in."
As Shane neared me, he looked up and said,
"There a way to contact you, wizard? If I need Charlie found again, I mean."
You can call me for now." Elle interjected before I could say anything. Shane just nodded, accepting this piece of knowledge with equanimity. Only when he was gone did I turn to Elle and raise an eyebrow. "You're not ready to let them know where you live," she explained. "For one thing, you need some wards on your home." "Haven't learned that yet," I said, and Elle snorted. "I would hope not. It takes years for an enchanter to gain sufficient knowledge to ward a building properly. Now come on, let's get this over with." I followed along after the diminutive pixie, a half-smile on my face as I contemplated the dwarf and his cat. It might not have been much, but using my magic for something other than killing rats or practice had actually made me feel good. Useful. "Elle, why are we doing this?" I asked the pixie hours later. We were splitting a bowl of nachos for supper. "Because I'm hungry," said Elle, as she waved a nacho laden with jalapenos and cheese. "No, not supper, the meet and greet." I nodded my head toward where our server, a long, thin, praying mantis-like humanoid, took orders from a pair of frat boys. I had to smile internally as they goaded one another to hit on their server when she left. Unfocusing my eyes a little, I could understand why. The tall, leggy blonde glamour was quite a looker. "Safety," Elle said, and waved her hand around. "We need to get you introduced and your story straight. Until you learn to control your aura, you're glowing like a Christmas tree with all the arcane energy you're giving off. Anyone with the sight, or who has an enchantment to let them see, which is most everyone, can tell you're a new wizard." Oh. I sat back and thought about it. If she was right, and I did look like a floodlight, then there wasn't a way for me to hide my magic. Since I wasn't apprenticed, I couldn't be introduced as a mage, so I had to be a wizard, a new one at that, which set up my story and let others dismiss me. "Thanks." "De nada." Elle waved my thanks away. "Why are you helping me, Elle?" I asked. After the first time, "Oh, Henry," Elle said quietly, "I didn't want you to be part of this world, but since you seem bent on joining us, I might as well make sure you survive it, at least for a little while." The last few words were said softly. So softly I didn't think Elle meant for me to hear them. I still didn't understand her wariness, and Lily's. So far, everyone we'd met had been nice and civil. Well, other than the orcs, but muggers were muggers. You didn't expect them to be nice. Still. "Thank you." Elle flashed me a smile before she turned back to her beer and nachos. Chapter 8. The next couple of weeks were filled with small, minor quests that were generated by the supernatural denizens of my neighborhood. Once Elle had finished introducing me around that evening, I'd become just another fixture. Their very own wizard. What no one had told me was that wizards were relatively rare and occasionally useful to know. However, few magic users were approachable, often being the supernatural equivalent of shut-ins. After all, unlike me, most magic users had to spend hours memorizing and then practicing spells over and over again. Spending time running minor errands was the last thing on their minds. The quests offered to me never ranged into fetch 10 silver-capped mushrooms from the forest of never-ending anguish. But there were more along the lines of, my walk-in freezer broke down. Could you chill my meat until the repairman gets here? Or, can you please babysit my brood of half a dozen hyperactive ratkin? By the way, if anyone ever asks you about that last one, the answer is hell no. There's a reason Mrs. Umber had to ask an unemployed, newly developed wizard. Unlike my rat quest, these minor quests, or errands if you will, did not provide much in terms of experience gain. Spending an evening learning how to adjust my light spell to cast different colored lights for a vampire-only soiree might not have been particularly exciting, once you got over the fact that the vampires had no desire to drink your blood, but it was educational, and if I did say so myself, quite beautiful. Interesting fact, vampires were allergic to sunlight due to a specific curse by a sun god. It meant that light, even one filled with ultraviolet light, did nothing to vampires. It was why most vampires actually had a decent tan, even in winter. What better way to throw off hunters than not looking like a pale, gangly monster? Unfortunately, mend turned out to be significantly less useful than first envisioned. The spell actually encouraged previously separated pieces together, mending fractures and rips. It was, in some ways, very similar to the heal spell. However, it also required a degree of finesse to work properly. A mend spell on a broken button would fix the edges of the strings, but might do so with the button on the outside. In that, like so many other things, magic was less useful than a little hard work with needle and thread. After weeks of working with magic, much of my initial excitement had worn away with the realization that magic was cool, but more often than not, mundane solutions won out. It was disappointing, but at least partly explained why mages didn't rule the world. Magic was useful, but so was plain old science. All in all, the next few weeks saw a slow but gradual increase in strength and ability as I pushed my own knowledge of magic. Whether it was learning to hit and maintain a specific temperature with my spells, altering the color of light, or avoiding concussions while babysitting, those kids were vicious, I had managed to actually gain another level. Class, Mage, level 4, 12% experience, known spells, Light Sphere, Force Missile, Heat, Freeze, Chime, Breeze, Lesser Shield, Heal, Link, Mend, Ward. Unlike my previous level gain, there were fewer changes in my spells. I might have gotten better at controlling the spells themselves, but according to Lily, the major changes required me to improve significantly more. Ward, on the other hand, was my first warding spell. It actually wasn't a complete spell by itself. Each ward spell had to be combined with another spell before it could be activated, and it required me to physically carve the ward into an object. A light ward, for example, basically created a fixed light spell that could, with a small exertion of will, be turned on or off, at least until the spell charge died. At my current level, all I could do was put up wards that could be triggered by simple events. An exertion of magical will, the opening or closing of a door, physical pressure. I could not even chain more than one spell together at a time, a prerequisite for actual workable wards. Still, it didn't stop me from spending half a day carving wards into various pieces of furniture throughout the house. I only stopped when Lily promised to turn me into a lump of salt if I didn't stop. Over the course of a few weeks, perhaps the greatest gain I saw was in the understanding of the information Lily had downloaded into my mind. I began to understand mana and magic, and how mana was just a short-form placeholder for the power of creation itself. Mages were people who were able to manipulate mana, using incantations and spell formulas to do what they desired. In truth, after speaking with Lily and Elle a bit, mages weren't even the most powerful or competent group. Clerics, shamans, and other faith workers could all manipulate mana just as well, though they were often restricted by the tenets of their faiths and their gods. Furthermore, the incantations and spell formulas didn't matter. It was why there were so many branches of magic to study in the world. It was not the words themselves, but the intentions and mental energy expended that dictated the formation of the spells. By focusing the mind and that mana muscle that mages had, they could cast spells, channeling them through their body as appropriate to their gift. Rumors were that the most powerful mages could cast spells with just a thought. Of course, I was miles away from anything like that. All things said and done, the last few weeks had been peaceful and surprisingly fulfilling. Running deliveries for Elle when I had no other quests to do, helping out in the neighborhood, and receiving pay for it all. It was fun. For once in my life, I actually thought I was getting somewhere. I should have known it would never last. The first sign of trouble was the shattered basement door. The second was the raised voices, as Lily argued with a stranger in her home. I formed a force missile in my hand, holding it low so it couldn't be seen easily, and stepped across my threshold to meet the danger. After all, that was what heroes did. Lily was standing in front of her computer, hands on her hips, and one foot tapping the ground, as she argued with my intruder. My intruder, who towered over the diminutive genie, was clad in gray slacks, a cream button-down shirt, and a long black woolen coat. He could easily have walked around downtown and not drawn a glance, which made his presence in my run-down basement apartment even stranger.
"You will come with me,"
the stranger finished demanding when I stepped in. Like a trigger, he swiveled around to glare at me before his gaze fixed on my ring. Without even speaking, he raised his hand, fingers splaying around and twisting a few times, before he jerked it toward himself. For the briefest of moments, I felt a tugging on the ring before I clenched my fist tight, and the tugging faded. Out-of-level opponent encountered. Please increase level before continuing encounter. Unknown assailant, mage level 187? "No, you can't take his ring away," Lily said, snapping at the man. "I told you it's useless."
"What in the blazes?"
The man growled and raised his hands, repeating what had to be a spell. This time there wasn't even a faint tug. "Stop that!" I snapped at him and added, "And who the hell are you?"
"How?"
Eyes narrowed. The man stared at me and my hand while he ignored my question. With a shrug, he strode over to me and grabbed at my hand, coming to a stop inches away from my body. Reflexively, I swung the hand that held the force missile and watched the formed spell shatter a foot away from the man's body, a rainbow of colors rippling from the point of impact.
"A wizard,"
the man snarled, and he flicked a finger and pointed at me. A force spear formed and shot toward my face faster than I could react. Before it reached me, the force spear disappeared, as if it had never existed.
"What?"
We both cried out in unison. Out-of-level opponent encountered. Please increase level before continuing encounter. Again, the words flashed in front of my face, and this time I actually read them. Out of level. Oh, like the orcs.
"Genie, you did this."
The man turned and snarled at Lily, who smirked at him. "Yes, I did. Told you you aren't taking his ring," Lily said once more. "Who are you?" I demanded again, glaring at the man as I moved away from him, courage bolstered by the fact that he really couldn't do anything. It seemed whatever Lily had done, it worked both ways, and stopped me from hurting him, too.
"I am Caleb Hahn, Magus of the Third Circle, and I demand you return that ring."
If he thought to intimidate me by looming, he'd chosen the wrong person. I'd grown up my whole life as the short Asian, and after a while, you either learn to ignore the height disparity, or just become totally screwed over by it. I glared right back at him, my hand clenched tight as I snapped, "No! Now fuck off before I call the cops."
"The cops? You would call mundane humans on this, you unworthy peasant,"
Caleb said. "Well, yeah. You broke my door and you were refusing to leave. I can't hurt you and you can't hurt me." I pulled out my cell phone. "Now you leaving or not?" Caleb's eyes grew wide, and he spluttered a few more times, something about the sanctity of supernatural affairs, but his clarity was not helped by Lily giggling and holding her sides next to me. When I started dialing, Caleb finally threw his hands up and stalked out of the room, retreating with as much dignity as he could. Asshole never even offered to fix my door either. Thankfully, with a little elbow grease and the men's spell, the door was an easy patch, since he had only busted the knob itself. It was after all that was done with that I had the time to speak with Lily. So what was that about? I asked Lily, who was looking uncharacteristically serious when I turned to look at her.
That was meant to be the end of this, Lily replied, waving her hand around. But now that we've thwarted them, I love that word, thwarted, they'll have to regroup and think about it.
I know what it was. I want to know what it was about, I said.
Lily paused, staring at me before answering.
The ring, it was previously owned by a mage in the Order. You probably realize that. They want the ring and me back. Finders keepers not a thing in the supernatural world? I asked lightly.
No, Lily said bitingly, glaring at me till she realized I was taking this seriously. They will be back.
Can they break the wish? Or am I going to be expecting a lot of, How many circles are there?
7, but they'd have to send an apprentice to deal with you, Lily said. You wouldn't even qualify for one of their circles yet.
But I'm level 4, I spluttered.
And the minimum level to get out of being an apprentice would be around level 20 or so, I'd say. And to actually become a member of the council, you'd have to be level 40 at least. Maybe 50, Lily said.
Oh, I frowned. But my spells are a cheat. You can cast certain spells because of what I've given you, but your understanding of magic itself is pitiful.
Hey, could you recreate any of your spells yourself? Lily shot back.
I frowned, thinking about it. I focused for a second, trying to recreate the light spell from basics. After all, it was the spell I used the most, and thus should have been most familiar with. The beginning was simple. I could remember that part easily enough. About a third of the way in, I realized I was having to cudgel my brain to extract the necessary mental gymnastics required to continue casting the spell. About halfway through, I felt the spell fizzle, the feedback sending a spike of pain through my head like an ice pick through my eye.
Told you, Lily said.
I grunted, rubbing at my eyes as the pain faded. Fine. Perhaps I relied on the ready-made intuitive spells she had provided too much. It'll be a while before they actually send someone, though. The council isn't very quick at making decisions or changing their minds. Lily fixed me with a glare. However, that doesn't mean you can slack off. Once they decide to move, they will move. Yeah, but if I get better, my level goes up and they can throw more at me. You do realize that levels aren't exactly accurate. I mean, it's one thing to stop a third circle mage coming at you, but if they aren't putting out magic like a sun, things start getting a bit more complicated. A mugger or a hitman, from my perspective, is only a few levels difference, but from yours is significant, Lily said, and I grunted. She had a point. And rather more importantly, I hadn't chosen to learn magic so I could hide in a corner at the first sign of trouble. If I was going to learn magic, I was going to learn it properly, which meant I'm going to need better quests then. As Lily smiled, I felt a chill go through my body. Chapter 9. 5 feet tall, red, muscular, and naked with a pair of horns, a whip-like tail, and tiny wings that couldn't support a bat, the imp raised his fist, ready to pound me into the floor again in the back kitchen of the Italian mom-and-pop shop we were battling in. Thankfully, the imp was a lot like my high school bullies, all strength, no finesse, and the haymaker he threw was telegraphed from a mile away. I ducked underneath the punch, losing a precious second as I wobbled on my feet, my balance still a bit shot from earlier blows. I twisted my fingers in a circle and pointed as I chanted the words, "Force missile." A ball of blue and green formed in the circle, shooting forward as I finished chanting and pointing, striking the imp in its chest. Force missile cast, 89% synchronicity. Force bolt does 15 damage to lesser imp. The attack just pissed the imp off further, and it swung a tight uppercut that caught me in the chest, throwing my frail form backward. I smashed into the closet refrigerator door and groaned, the back of my head sending pain signals from where it had been knocked around even further. Henry Alfred Chan Tsien dealt 23 damage by lesser imp. Even as I twisted my fingers around to cast another spell, the imp battered my hand away disdainfully. Through tear-filled eyes, I stared at my would-be murderer. Lesser imp, level 4, HP 1343. Before the monster could finish me off, a thrown cast-iron pan caught it in the back of its head. I swore I saw a little red 1 float off the top of its head, though I wasn't sure if that wasn't just the incipient concussion or an actual artifact of Lily tinkering with a wish. The imp, distracted, turned around and stalked to its new prey. "Do something!" Chantal Rossi, the imp's attacker and my current quest giver, screamed at me as she scrambled around the kitchen for more things to throw at the monster. Reminded I wasn't part of the audience in this life-or-death struggle, I cast my force missile spell. Once again, I received a notification with an 84% synchronicity rate, more than enough to deal the damage needed to end the imp. This time, when the force missile hit, it cracked the monster's skull, leaving its corpse slumped against the sink. I groaned, sitting down as I stared at the blinking blue bar that indicated I had nearly no mana left. Lesser imp, level 4, defeated. My benefactor was not taking the sudden change in fortunes in stride. Instead, having scooped up a pan to smash the dead monster around a few more times. Only when it did not attempt to defend itself did she stop. Chantal stood over the dead monster, long black hair disheveled and white blouse popped open, green blood staining it. When she turned to me, eyes sparkling with fury, her lips pulled into a snarl. You were hired to fix the problem, not make it worse," she snapped as she stalked toward me, waving the bloody pot in her hand. A piece of pasta, resiliently holding on against the tyranny of gravity, finally succumbed and dropped to the ground, landing by her feet. This, thankfully, made her pause in her tirade long enough for me to get a word in. "Sorry, it was just supposed to be a level 4 imp," I spluttered, as I pushed myself up, my chest aching as I breathed. Damn demon had fists like boulders. "What do you mean, level 4? The raven-haired proprietress said, shaking her head. "Look at this mess. You're going to cost us more to have the place fixed up than the damage the imp was doing." At Chantal's accusation, I slowly, very slowly, as my neck and head were still throbbing, surveyed the room. Shattered glassware, spilled food, a few broken cupboards, and a hole in the microwave from an errant force missile greeted my eyes in quick succession. "Sorry, we're taking the imp's body, and don't expect to get paid." "But A quick shake of the pot was enough to make me back down. A few more apologies, and I finally managed to extricate myself from the kitchen and Rossi's, her family restaurant, without being beaten to death. Outside, I paused for a second to take in the beautiful, clear day and breathed in the clear, clean air. On the opposite side of the street, a few others stared at me strangely, basking in the sunlight, including a bespectacled teenager who was actually glaring. I had to smile as I relaxed and shook off the berating I'd received. I was alive and learning magic. What else could I ask for? As I got out of my ride and tapped my phone to acknowledge having been dropped off, I found myself grateful I'd decided to skip biking. My head throbbed, my back spasmed, and I found myself fumbling my keys to my basement suite. I kicked the door closed behind me, whimpered at the loud noise, and crashed on my futon. When I woke up later that evening, almost all my injuries were healed once again. A quick perusal of the notifications explained things to me. Henry Alfred Chan Hak Tsien is well rested, plus 5% experience gain for 4 hours. Henry Alfred Chan Hak Tsien has gained 37 health points due to resting. I really needed to get Lily to stop messing with the notifications, but ever since she'd seen a bill with my full name, she'd been on this kick of putting it everywhere. As my stomach growled, I got up to throw a ready-made pizza in the oven. I turned my head to stare at the jinn, who was hovering over my computer. I had thought picking up a second laptop for myself would have freed up a computer for my use. Instead, Lily had just decided to take them both over, and was running 2 different games at the same time. That was not a level 4 imp, I grumped at Lily. Silence lingered for so long, I thought she might not have heard me, punctuated only by the tapping on the keyboard and click of her mouse. "Yes, it was," Lily said. "You just suck at fighting." "I'm supposed to be good at it?" I muttered, shaking my head. The imp had been my second combat quest, and I had to admit she was right. At least I hadn't gotten bitten, but it wasn't as if I'd ever had any real experience fighting for my life. Scraps with schoolyard bullies and the occasional mugging did not count, after all. I wasn't a soldier or police officer or a martial artist. I was just a guy who liked computer and role-playing games and found a magic ring. You ready for the next one? Lily asked. Goddamn noob, do your job! I glared at Lily, but since she wasn't bothering to look up, the glare did just about nothing. In the end, I gave up. You know, I'm new at this, but calling me a noob is a little rude. Not you, it's this damn cleric. Can't heal for shit. I'm dying here, Lily said, a hand briefly waving at her game. She turned her head to the side, eyeing the other game before returning to the one she was focused on. It seemed in the second game she was flying some spaceship that was moving on autopilot, stars shifting as she kept turning and jumping. Though if the shoe fits... Whatever, I growled. You said you have a new quest? Take your pick, Lily said, pointing to a pile of papers. I frowned, walking to them, picking them up and scanning the headlines. Persistent slime mold is eating away my floors. Clean it out, $200. Leprechaun escapee, capture and return, no corpses, 185 gold coins, and a brindle tulip. Become a hellhound trainer, no special skills required. We will train on the job, fair compensation. The Grey Angels Hospice is looking for healers. Volunteer your time with our great staff and residents. Required an experienced exorcist, $350. Gremlin squatter removal, $500. I stared at the printouts. A sneaking suspicion confirmed when I looked at the web address printed on the top. Is this a classifieds website? Hey! Give that back! Lily shouted a moment later as I pulled my new laptop onto my lap. Hush. I tabbed away from her game. Within seconds, I was at the site, or what would have been the site if not for a big password-protected sign. A couple seconds of fumbling indicated Lily had not saved her password either. How do I get in? You don't, Lily said, tapping furiously at her keyboard for a few seconds before turning to me. That's way too much responsibility for you right now. Oh, come on, I'm just going to browse it. Too dangerous. Browsing? I said. I promise not to download any viruses. And how about spells, demonic entities, and mana traps? I paused, pushing the laptop away from me slightly. Demons can come through the web? That just sounded like a bad B-movie setup. Not normally, but that website isn't on the normal internet. It's a separate dimensional nexus that the supernatural use, and the defenses that have been applied against such incursions are relaxed there. Otherwise, only entities on this dimension could post on it, Lily said. At her words, I edged even farther away from my laptop, my eyes wide. There are other dimensional beings posting on that? Like gods and demons and Lovecraft monsters? And angels, jinn, fae, dragons, ice giants, Lily continued on. Of course there are. Merle's Web is the most popular communication form right now. Not that there aren't competing sites, but Merle seems to have kept up with the times. Merlin? I asked suspiciously. Yes, the old codger might be trapped, but he's still got his hand in the pie. Lily shook her head. Once I got back in touch with him, he pointed me to the site. Merlin's alive. I sat with a thump, staring at Lily. You'd think that after months of all this, I would have gotten used to being surprised, but still. And Arthur? Dead, or sleeping, don't know. You'd have to ask Merle. Not that he's talking. Lily shrugged her shoulders. He's, a bit annoyed about all that. How about Lancelot, Gawain, the Green Knight, the Holy Grail? Questing, Lily drawled, and pointed to the papers again. I growled softly, but even repeated prodding had her repeating the same word again and again. Eventually, I gave up and went over the quests available. A good half of them seemed to involve killing, finding, or eradicating something. There were no fetch quests, probably because I received more than enough of those from Elle, who at least knew enough to give me exact directions. It wasn't as if I knew where to find fairy dust or three-eyed spotted mushrooms. In the end, I highlighted a couple I was willing to do and handed them to Lily. Right, out then. Once I get details, you'll know. That's it? I frowned, having expected, more details now. Yes, now shoo. We're running the Virtuous Grotto, and I don't need you bothering me, Lily said, waving me away. Kicked out of my own apartment, I grabbed my jacket on the way out. Oh well, maybe Elle had something interesting. After making my way to Nora's, I found Elle seated at the counter, smiling cheerfully at an unexpected mundane customer. I watched Elle for a second, my gaze unfocused, to see her as her glamour rather than her true form before refocusing my eyes. I had to admire the svelte figure she cut, at least underneath her glamour, though I had to wonder, what did it look like if someone saw me checking her out and was unable to see through her glamour? On the other hand, one could never tell with others' tastes. "Henry!" Her voice brought me out of my ruminations, and I realized her customer had left. "Did you need something?" "No." I shook my head. Then, girding up my courage, I stepped up to the counter, flashing her a smile. "Actually, no." "You didn't even—" "Henry, I'm 436 years old. I know what you were going to ask, and the answer is no," Elle said, and smiled at me gently. "Well, I paused, staring at Elle. I felt slightly deflated at having my advances shot down, even before I'd gotten started. I looked around, awkward now, as I kicked myself for even trying. I should have known better. After all, Elle had never indicated any interest in me before, beyond a general kindly interest in my well-being. Pretty much what you'd expect a big sister to show a little brother, in fact. "It's not personal, Henry. I might only be a lesser fae, but I am fae. I'll live for another 1,000 years. And, well, as a human mage," Elle said, shrugging her shoulders, "it's better this way." "Oh," I nodded slightly. I guess that made sense. I mean, the elves in the Lord of the Rings series were like that too, and I was no Aragorn. "So is there anything else you came in for?" "Not really. I actually thought you might have something for me to do," I answered, looking back up to see Elle smiling at me patiently. Not sure I need to remodel the shop yet." I winced. "You heard about that." "Just a little. Showing you around kind of tied you to me," Elle said. "Yeah, sorry about that. The imp was tougher than I thought," I said, shrugging my shoulders. "It's fine. Used to be you couldn't swing a cat without hitting a magical troubleshooter. Now everyone wants to be an office mage or animator or enchanter," Elle said, shaking her head. "I guess it works out for you, though. Otherwise no one would hire you." "Thanks." I shook my head again. "Anyway, did you have anything you need me to help with?" "Actually," Elle said, smiling slightly and reaching under the counter. In her hand, when she lifted it, was a simple brown paper-wrapped package. I took it automatically, jiggling it slightly and noting a clink of glass containers before I slid it into my black messenger bag. "Don't do that! What if it was salamander spit?" It's highly explosive," Elle sighed. "So is it?" "No, and you shouldn't be asking what's in the packages. You know that," Elle said, exasperatedly, shaking her head. "It's arthritis rub for Grandma Gale." A quick scribble, and she handed me the address on a post-it note. "I thought I wasn't supposed to know what was in there," I said. "You're not normally, but you're going to need to know for this. Now, be polite and nice. You're going into orc territory." Elle held up a finger. "Just tell them what and who you're delivering for, and they'll leave you alone. Got it?" "You sell to orcs?" I asked incredulously. "I sell arthritis medicine to everyone," Elle said. "What, you think I should let Grandma Gale suffer because she's green and tusky?" "No," I said, stepping back at the heat in Elle's voice. "Get it through your head, Henry. This isn't your fantasy books. These are people with their own hopes and dreams and lives. We're just people trying to get by in a world that isn't necessarily set up for us." I'm sorry. I'll do better," I said. At Elle's nod, I backed out and headed off to do her little courier job. Head hunched, I pulled out my phone and punched in the address to work out the fastest way to do this. One day, I'd get a car, but that would have to wait till I had a more regular and consistent source of income, one that did not rely on charity and magical windfalls. Fair Creek, in the southwestern part of the city, once hosted the city's docks. In the 1960s, the city had rebuilt the docks farther downriver, outside of the city proper, to handle the additional business. Now, Fair Creek was a mixture of run-down warehouses, squat concrete buildings, and crumbling docks, along with a few overburdened homeless shelters. Dotted throughout the neighborhood were failed attempts at revitalization. The scenic concrete and grass walkways along the river, unkept and not cleaned, a pair of soaring condos looming over their older cousins. It was no place to go if you weren't a resident. The natural resting place for those who had nowhere else to go. Not surprisingly, even though I'd lived in the city my whole life, I'd only been down this way twice. Once entirely by accident, the second on an ill-advised attempt at a hip-hop concert to impress a date. As I sat down on the worn-down upholstery of the bus, waiting for my stop, I stared at the residents with new eyes, Elle's words still ringing in my mind. Hunched-over hooded figures slunk from corner to corner, hands in baggy clothing. Under hoods, I caught glimpses of inhuman features, snouts, whiskers, fur, and more. Many had the barest of glamours on, just enough to pass a cursory inspection. Interestingly enough, most glamours showed the individuals as minorities. Perhaps most surprisingly was their number, 1 in 7. 1 in 8 of those on the streets were inhuman, a higher percentage by far than anywhere else. We're just people trying to get by in a world that isn't necessarily set up for us. How hard was life for a supernatural if your funds had to go to not only food, but glamour as well? If you had to cover up, hide your identity to survive? If the assholes who were casting glamour spells decided it cost extra to make you not look like a minority? I'd stumbled across magic and lucked out finding the golden ring, taking power by choice. Many of those I saw on the streets, they'd never had a choice. They were somber thoughts to think as I got off the bus and glanced at my phone one last time. I walked the streets to my destination, idly noting I was a good 6 blocks away. As I walked, I tried to remember all the hints about safely traversing a bad neighborhood I had ever read. Walk with purpose and keep looking around, but don't make eye contact for too long. Avoid touching, but don't act scared. You'd think that wielding magic would have made this walk easier, but now that I could see the scales, furs, and tusks of the denizens of this city, it really didn't. It didn't help that I'd probably shone like a beacon to everyone else, too. I was 2/3 of the way to my destination before I encountered my first problem. A group of orcs, hanging out on the corner in hoodies, torn jeans, and leather gloves, stared at me as I neared them. The stares intensified, even as I stepped to the side in an attempt to go around the group, an attempt that was foiled by a large, blocky body. "What you doing there, wizard?" The blocker stood in front of me, glaring down at my form. I blinked and gulped, stepping back. That was a mistake, as the orc stepped forward immediately, continuing to crowd me. "Well, this ain't your neighborhood." I opened my mouth to say something, but my throat closed with fear. While a part of me knew I was probably fine, due to Lily's wish, all my lizard brain knew was that there were 6 large, green, and very muscular figures looking at me aggressively. A pair of hands came up and shoved me backward, sending me stumbling back into a figure I hadn't even realized was behind me. "You gonna say something, boy?" "Delivery," I croaked out, and then cleared my throat, trying again as I pulled myself straight. "Delivery from Elle, for Grandma, Shit. My mind blanked on her name, the rush of adrenaline making my hands clammy. The looming figures and the casual bump against my shoulder as they crowded me made my breath tighten. "Grandma?" one of the orcs snorted, before another smacked him on the arm with the back of his hand. "You delivering the medicine for Grandma Gail?" the smacky asked, and I nodded in dumb relief. "You should have said so." A quick set of hand waves had the orcs stepping back, giving me breathing room. Without even waiting for me to recover, the speaker had already started walking. "Sorry about that. Elle never told us she was using a wizard for delivery." "It's fine. I'm new," I muttered, relief washing through my body as we walked toward our destination. "Ah, shit," the orc muttered, just before the loud blare of a siren went off behind us. Cruising to a stop, a police car stopped us half a block from the apartment building I was to make the delivery at. Inwardly, I cursed, getting nervous once more. It was strange how I could get nervous, even if I was doing nothing wrong in the presence of police. From out of the police car came an elf, a damn elf, with pointed ears, long hair, gleaming teeth, and a smirk. A human, who glowed just like me, came to stand beside me. I frowned, staring at the pair, and after a moment, their information finally populated. Police elf, level 28. Police mage, level 32. "What do we have here?" the elf said, smirking at us as he walked toward us. The orc was standing beside me, hands held to the side and away from his body, his face fixed. "A wizard and an orc walking down the street." I said, and then decided to clamp my mouth shut. Surprising fact about having conversations about the supernatural in public? No one cared. Between fantasy movies, LARPers, and just normal human self-conceit, the occasional overheard conversation was easily dismissed. Still, most supernaturals weren't this blatant. Then again, this wasn't exactly your normal suburban neighborhood either. "Which got your tongue, wizard?" the elf said, staring at me, baton suddenly in his hand. He moved so smoothly and quickly, I didn't see it again until it was under my chin and pushing my head up. A hot flash of anger went through me, but I forced it down. "Just doing a delivery," I said hoarsely, fighting the roiling emotions of anger, shame, and fear running through me. Damn it! A hand went to my bag, and I automatically moved to push it aside. A second later, I found myself on the ground. A knee ground into the small of my back. One hand outstretched and the other curled around my body, pain radiating from my knee and chin where I had been slammed into the ground when the human had tossed me down. "Trying to stop us from doing our job, are you?" A crank on my arm made me grunt in pain. The strap of my back was pulled aside, and I felt the tension suddenly release. The bag pulled out from underneath me, not too gently. "I wasn't lying to a police officer. Tisk," the mage said, shaking his head. "I hate your kind. Thinking you're all something because you learned a little magic." "Shut up," the orc growled at me, and then released a sudden exhalation of breath shortly after a meaty thunk. I couldn't turn my head, and any attempt at moving resulted in another shooting pain from my arm. Andy, I thought you knew better," the elf said, mockingly. I heard the clasp of my bag open, and then the noise of the contents of my bag hitting the ground. The muffled thunk of the package, my notebook, and the rest of the random crap that I kept in my bag reached my ears. A short while later, I heard the tearing of paper before a dull thunk of glass on concrete. I found myself exhaling in thanks that all of Elle's packages were in ultra-tough enchanted containers. "What is this? A sharp jab in my back made me arch slightly. "We're talking to you, wizard," the mage said. "Arthritis remedy," I said, through stolen breaths. "Really?" Indistinct noises and a loud sniff later. An open bottle landed on the ground next to me, with its lid and the remaining bottles. "Smells like shit. You peddling shit, wizard?" "I'm just bringing it for Elle," I said. Elle, that little troublesome pixie," the elf muttered. "I thought she knew better than to deal with scum like this. Well, I guess we'll just have to do something about that." "What?" I asked, as I twisted my head around. The mage let me do so briefly before he reapplied pressure, forcing me to look on futilely as the elf raised his booted foot and came down on the bottle. It shattered under his boot, his foot rising again. Anger flashed through me, at the mage and the elf and the damn orc who just stood there. The elf raised his foot again to smash another bottle. "Now be sure to tell Elle." "That's enough, Quinn," a low, husky, and dangerous voice said from the opposite side of my head. "You had your fun." "Mark," the elf said, sudden wariness in his voice. I could feel the mage above me shift his weight, turning toward the newcomer. "Let him go." The same voice growled, and my arm was released. Footsteps shifted, and as I sat up slowly, rubbing my shoulder, I noted the policeman had backed off. Staring at the newcomer, I turned my head to look as well, and had to agree. The newcomer was definitely worth staring at. Where Andy, my erstwhile guide, had been big, the newcomer could have fronted for an NFL team at nearly 7 feet tall and nearly half again as broad. Behind the newcomer was another trio of orcs, none as large as he was, but only by a hairbreadth. "Just making sure the wizard knows what's what," the elf said, smirking still. However, I noticed the pair had their hands near their guns now, and were, in fact, moving back to their car easily. "No harm done." Under the watchful eyes of the orcs, the pair of policemen left. I pulled together my bag, stuffed everything together, and held the broken straps in hand while my emotions raged. I could mend them, but unlike some, I preferred to keep my magic to quieter and less public locations. "Well, boy, you gonna make your delivery?" The orc snapped at me, and I blinked, nodding quickly. I moved forward, hesitating for a second when he held a hand up to Andy to stop him from coming with me. A quick look told me his signal wasn't for me, and so I headed up the stairs. You'd think, after all that Grandma Gale was some mythical, powerful shaman or power behind the throne. Instead, Grandma Gale was exactly what you'd have expected of a grandmother. Old, bent, wrinkled, and, in this case, green. She was more than grateful for the delivery and completely forgiving about the single broken bottle. 2 hours later, filled with tea and cookies, I tottered out of the grateful orc's neat apartment, surprised to see Andy waiting for me. "Andy." "I'll walk you back," Andy said, and then held out his hand. Taking the dollar bills from him automatically, I frowned as I stared at them. "For the broken bottle." I paused, unsure. "Just take it. I should have seen him coming," Andy said, and I nodded dumbly as I fell into step with him. "They do that often?" I asked. "Every chance they get. Fucking pigs like to hassle us," Andy said, shaking his head. "They pick on us in particular because, well, you know, because they were orcs." "Sorry." "Why are you sorry?" Andy growled at me, and I winced, ducking my head. After a moment, Andy shook his head. "Never mind. It's not your fault." "Yeah, assholes," I grumbled, running my finger over the mended strap. Even now, I could feel the slight raises and bumpiness from the mend spell. At least I was getting better with a spell. Still, a part of me twisted at how easily I'd rolled over. But what was I supposed to do? They were cops, and higher levels than me. In sullen silence, the pair of us made our way back to the bus stop, where we stood, brooding over our respective failures. The bus, when it arrived, found us still standing in silence. "Take care, wizard. You try not to get beaten up by cops again, huh?" Andy said, waving goodbye as I got on. I had to chuckle slightly, nodding back to Andy. Well, that had been enlightening and humbling, if somewhat less than useful for my leveling. Then again, perhaps not all experience needed to come with levels. Hours later, I went back home. Lily, surprisingly, was not on the computer, but standing over the oven. I eyed the dark-haired genie as she stirred a pot of instant noodles and then walked to my computers without a word. On them, blue screens showed the software had updated. That was one mystery easily solved. "Lily," I said, walking over to lean against a cupboard. "Wanted to ask you something." "Sure," Lily said, eyes raking over me. I quickly explained my encounter with the orcs and the cops, finishing with, how come the cops were able to touch me? I mean, they were obviously out of level. "Thought it might be that," Lily said, tapping her spoon against the pot before she carefully poured the contents into a waiting bowl. "The answer is that the encounter was a social challenge, not a physical one." "Felt pretty physical to me," I grumbled, rubbing my still sore shoulder. "Only because you failed your social check," Lily said, looking up at me. "I don't really get that, you know," I said. "I mean, what makes it a social encounter rather than a physical one? Aren't most encounters social till, well, they're not?" Yes." Lily paused and then waved a hand to the computers before she returned to stirring the bowl. "But we're talking about your wish, and the way I set it up. And I did it by watching the games. If you run into a city and start ganking the guards, You don't expect to get away with it, do you? Same thing here. The police, most legal authorities, are going to be exempt. But those guys were assholes, I said, grumbling. It'd have been nice if they couldn't have grabbed me. And then what? Lily said, raising an eyebrow. Do you think the fact that they couldn't touch you would de-escalate the situation? Make them decide to pack it up and go away? It did for the Mage, I said. Uh-huh. And we both know he'll be back, or someone like him. Lily shook her head. You don't want the authorities getting wind of you, especially the mundane ones. I guess, I said. I looked at Lily, eyes narrowed, as I voiced my other suspicion. Still rather convenient that the wish failed then. Must have been pretty elaborate programming for you to have set that up. Wasn't set up. I made the call once I saw it happening, Lily said, confirming my suspicion. You can do that? Of course. Lily pointed to my hand, and her ring that sat on it. I'm still linked to the ring. So long as you wear it, I'll always have some awareness of you and your surroundings. Ensuring encounters happen logically and according to your wish is part of my job, after all. Huh, I said, nodding slowly. Well, that made sense. And it was what I'd signed up for. Still, knowing Lily was spying on me was just a little creepy. Then again, after a while, I'd gotten used to the great god Google tracking my searches and where I traveled every day. How was this any different, really? Hey, why didn't they do something about my ring? I mean, those guys seem like the kind who'd steal them. The ring has an obscuration enchantment on it. You'd have to be significantly more powerful before you could pierce it, Lily answered promptly. Like the Mage, I said, and got a confirming nod. Then Elle? We walked through her wards into her place of power, Lily said, and I nodded. It still didn't explain why Lily never showed Elle's level to me. But I left that for now. I'd asked before and never gotten a satisfactory answer. We done? Because my food's getting cold. Yeah. I waved her back to her life, as I wandered back to the pile of quest notes. Might as well check out what else she had found.